Hello, my name is Pete Saronis, and I am super excited today to lead a panel discussion with my esteemed colleagues who you will meet and hear about here in a quick minute. We're going to discuss a very important topic that's relevant today with what's going on in the world: infrastructure, carrier technologies, how these technologies and services are supporting our nation's critical infrastructure, most notably the energy grid. My name's Pete Saronis. I'm the former Chief Technology Officer at the U.S. Department of Energy. I had a great run in the federal government, worked over 4 administrations for 3 agencies, and this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Our hope today is to inform, educate, and enlighten. And with these folks on this webcast, you're going to learn, you're going to hear about, you're going to have perspective offered that will hopefully trigger you to want to learn more, because whether you're a C-level or you're a homemaker or you're a kid in school, this topic is something that touches on what we as human beings depend on each and every day, and that's power that powers our life and our businesses. So that's a little bit about me. Industry Insights is a program that, with the great backing of Anterix, a company that's the largest holder of licensed spectrum in the 900 megahertz band, there were some terms there that we will discuss, is proud to bring to this community, and our representatives from 3 carrier networks, solution providers today are part of that extended family. Anterix has also launched, if you didn't catch it yesterday, its active ecosystem program, which is super exciting and we'll talk about and make reference to. It's a collaborative community that's bringing together stakeholders in a bipartisan manner. These are my words, so that we can really tackle the cyber physical issues that are front and center, again, with the Colonial Pipeline, for example, what happened down in Texas, and every other natural or man-made disaster that unfortunately we've experienced. But we'll hear about the membership, and if you have any other questions, please reach out at Anterix.com, and the good folks from Danielle Kohler to Deanne to Chris Gutman McCabe to Morgan O'Brien, Robert Schwartz, and of course Ryan Gerbrand and so many others, they will be absolutely excited to help you become a part of that community. So with that, super excited. We are going to talk about a number of things that range from the democratization of spectrum. We're going to talk a little bit about standards, and then we will touch on a few of the exciting Internet of Things, smart grid applications that these carrier network organizations are responsible for. But really quickly, the guests that we see or you see on your screen, and forgive me if I look down, it's just because I can't memorize everything. Craig Christoph, Vice President and Director at Motorola Solutions. Christoph Gashal, Vice President and Head of Utilities, Energy, and Industrials at Ericsson. And Ken, whatever I end up calling him, Ken Rabideau from the Nokia organization, Chief Technology Officer focusing on transportation, energy, and public sector. So with that, and I hope I didn't butcher any names, I'm going to kick it over to Craig. And Craig, a little bit more about you, fill in the gaps, and talk a little bit about your passion about this topic and working at Motorola.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hey, excited to be here. I want to say thanks to Anterix and Pete. I think we go way back in the NIST days. So looking forward to a good panel here. So really, hey, there's so much going on in the industry right now. Motorola's been, involved with land mobile radio, kind of a pioneer around that. And we've been involved with carrier, LTE, pioneer around that in the day as well. But really, we're starting to see a convergence. And what excites me about the convergence is really the change in the industry, right? If you think about technology, and I've been with Motorola for, I hate to say it, but 33 years out of the 93 years. So I've seen a lot of change, right? And I think the only thing that's really been constant is change, right? And if you think about technology, how it evolves, we're up against that huge technology bubble right now, where how is the grid changing with some of the things going on with distributed energy, around cybersecurity, around climate, population shift. So many different things out there. How do we design? How do we look at the standards? Those are all the things Motorola is looking at. So that's what really excites me right now, Pete. Just getting around, trying to get our hands around the change and the technology shift that we're in.
Well, Craig, you also in our prep calls really emphasized how important risk, cyber physical risk identification is, and I know that's near and dear, and we look forward to some of those comments, but absolutely fired up to have you on the panel today. I'm going to kick it down to Christoph Gashal. I know I nailed that name, Christoph.
And, absolutely, you did.
he's a utilities guy, and why don't you talk a little bit about your passion for this space and also what you love about working at the wonderful company Ericsson?
Well, I mean, I've been involved in so many different facets of the utilities industry, or power industry in particular, the transmission, distribution, power generation, to a certain degree on the retail side of it as well. For, I don't know, similar to Craig, probably over 3 decades now. And I've seen the change. Although people accuse this industry of being stodgy and you know not capable of changing. But what you've got to remember is some of the words that you used in your introduction. We're talking about mission critical purpose for this industry. This is not about, hey, if I don't get my package delivered to my home, somebody's going to die. Well, it can happen. I'm not saying. But in the utilities industry, everything is mission critical. You're providing a vital service to society, I think how you couched it. And as we are seeing this industry evolve, if you will, right, whether these are external noise in the form of cyber attacks or some 14-year-old hacking out of somewhere, right? Colonial Pipeline is a great example of somebody taking an entire pipeline system hostage, right?
Mhm.
Utilities can't afford this. It's as some of the utilities executives have shared with me that in an ideal world, we would love to have an air gap between us and the rest of the world. Now, we know that is physically impossible because you've got to communicate with the rest of the world. What is the safest, most reliable way a utility can communicate with the rest of the world is what we're going to talk about. And one of the topics that I'm really passionate about is this democratization of what we call as the airwaves, right? The federal government is allowing some of these spectral bands to become available for the mission critical industries, utilities being one of them. And it's an incredible thing that is happening. We've seen CBRS auction happen. We've seen Anterix's own 900 megahertz band now available for utilities, right? How do we leverage these tools and to create that environment of protective environment for utilities to run their assets and operations? That's kind of excites me.
Well, that's awesome, and I think that's a great pivot over to Ken. And when we get into the meat of this, you hit on a number of topics. And I think the key word for a lot of our listeners today is going to be integration, interoperability. I call it the abilities. There is flexibility, sustainability, security, but it's not security ability, but reliability and resilience. This isn't easy, folks. And I think when we talk about that democratization and integration, the standards, Craig, it's all going to hopefully makes sense to our viewers today. So Ken, you're up. Passion and what do you love most or most recently about working at Nokia?
Yeah, I didn't realize when we joined this panel that the 30 plus years was going to be a qualifier for the panel, but I guess I'm in good company here with everybody else, so that's a good thing. I actually also I have a carrier background before I went to the utility space, and then before I came to Nokia, so I have been on the carrier side, I've been on the utility side, and now on the vendor side. So for me, I've always loved the different uses and adoption use cases for technology, where technology can enable businesses, especially in like the utility industry, where the utility companies are becoming more of technology companies. You usually think of Google or Amazon or Microsoft as being the big cloud providers, but more and more you're seeing utility companies step up and embrace the technologies, and it's fun to see the industry move forward like that and be passionate about new use cases and modernizing infrastructure. So I think at Nokia, I get to be in the forefront of that with, Motorola, with Ericsson, all companies that are focused on doing similar things. So I'm happy to be on the panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I think for those watching, we got about 120 years because I've got my 30 as well. And somehow, hopefully, this will resonate. But we stay current. We're not old dinosaurs. Okay, so thank you for the intros and a little bit of background. I want to remind everyone watching, and either today or at a later date, that we're going to hit on a couple of topics, topics that may make sense initially, may not. Wireless, private LTE, broadband, spectrum. This is why Anterix, and I love it, is bringing communities together to not only understand the vernacular or speak it, but what does it mean? And I like to talk about, in my world with dots and bridges, why do I care? Why is this important to me? And I think when we flip a switch on, or we go in a car, or we breathe in the air, or we drink some water, we sure as hell heck hope that the owners and operators of that infrastructure, the critical infrastructure, it's safe, it's drinkable, because when it's not, bad things happen. Okay, so this isn't gloom and doom, this is art of the possible, but also we have to balance innovation with risk. So let's kick it off a bit into the meat of Craig, I'm going to start with you. We talk about these 16 critical infrastructure sectors in our country as defined by the Department of Homeland Security, energy, transportation, manufacturing, water. Those are the sectors we depend on. And if technology and carrier networks and standards are all underpinning it so that citizens and residents in the cities becoming smarter cities, connected cities, can you speak to how you've seen this evolution of just wireless technologies and maybe the promise of private LTE become a discussion that excites people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of interest around interoperability between smart city. You and I both spent a little time. You're the chair now. I was the chair before you on a NIST organization, which is called Global Cities Team Challenge, right? And I think it was super interesting to see these smaller companies innovate and how we can work closer with utilities, right? There's two things utilities have, right? They've got IT expertise and they got fiber. And that's what the cities need to start building out. And how do we leverage some of that joint effort between the cities and the utilities to create more of an ecosystem of how we can get smart cities tied into this. You also mentioned a couple other things too, that getting back to the risk and the critical infrastructure, right? There's 16 critical infrastructures. What do they all have in common, right? I mean, when the DHS defined these, every one of them used electricity, right? So you can say which one's the most important one, but electricity is super high on the list, right? And if you look at, we talked about cybersecurity. We're really thinking cybersecurity is one of the areas where, hey, we're investing, we're making acquisitions around cybersecurity. But if you look at the domestic threat, what's going on, there's also the foreign threat, right? You've got Russia, Korea, China, Tehran or Iran. All of those have shown interest, and they've all shown credible capabilities to attack our national defense, to attack our economics, to attack our critical infrastructure, and actually the way of life, right? You think about what the pandemic's done to the way of life. Think about if we don't have those critical infrastructures. So, during the pandemic, not to be joking around, but toilet paper, right? Think about how people have acted around toilet paper versus if you don't have water, right? What's the way of life going to happen? So I think that to me is one of the biggest risks, one of the biggest areas around cybersecurity. But I'll leave it at that and let the other ones jump in.
Yeah, and I think the cyber security and physical security discussion is one that you've not only emphasized, but cyber seems to be, oh, I better pay attention to that. Folks, remember what happened with the wildfires, what happened in Texas, what happened in Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, these physical disasters that impact the operational technology, the industrial control systems, are now integrating with the information technology, the internet, and that's where we get into these smart sensors and standards. I think is something that I know Motorola takes seriously, and we need to make sure stuff, when you plug it in, it will work with other things. So thank you for that point, Craig. Gustav, you democratization of spectrum. Can you geek out a little bit with us and help us understand the significant role that spectrum plays and why maybe a 900 megahertz is significant, especially when it comes to using broadband communications and private LTE?
Yeah, absolutely. Utilities, when you think about each of those mission critical industries or various societies, if you will, how do we serve those communities, right? Utilities are a very, very unique set, if you will, from a morphology perspective. In other words, the types of or density of endpoints that the utilities serve. You've got the metro networks, which is considered them as urban, like Manhattan, for example, right? Or downtown San Francisco or something, right? On top of that, they have underground networks, okay, most of those dense networks. Then you've got the urban or suburban networks, like, for example, Plano, Texas. I live in Plano, which is the suburb of Dallas, if you will. Then you go into the rural America, and then you start to think about, okay, you think about the technology requirement and then the economics associated with it. You can put up one tower in the middle of Manhattan, if you're allowed to, that is, just for sake of argument, and you could serve a wide array of use cases and meters. One tower in the middle of rural America, you may need that to serve one farmer in the middle of nowhere. But by law, you have to cover, from an electricity perspective, you have to cover that customer. How do you do that, right? It's an incredible problem for the utilities to face. Do I build the same density of infrastructure in rural America as I would in the middle of Manhattan? No, the answer is no. This is where spectrum comes in. Why? The lower the band of spectrum, not geeking out on anybody, the lower the band, which is why utilities love sub-gigahertz band of spectrum, as we like to call it. All right. Why? Propagation. They give you much bigger, longer, higher propagation, right? What does that mean in terms of economics? You have to build lesser number of cell sites to cover that geographical swath, if you will. Now, you could very easily use CBRS, which is mid-band spectrum, as we like to call it, which is in the 3.5 gigahertz band, in metro areas, in denser areas. Because if you run a radial circle, if you will, from one cell site, you're able to cover a lot more number of utilities endpoints. So from a utilities perspective, those endpoints are the subscribers, if you will, compared to carriers, whether it's an AT&T or Verizon, whoever. They consider these as the subscribers, the cell phones. For utilities, a meter is the subscriber, an IoT sensor is the subscriber. So that's where the democratization of spectrum comes in handy.
So I'm going to come to Ken, because now we're building off standards to actually the spectrum, which I was fortunate to manage at Energy, or fortunate, but learned a lot about the role. It is the most critical infrastructure component in my book. Yep. So that we can communicate, right? And how you prioritize or architect. Thank you for explaining just the high level, the propagation, for example, of 900 versus 700 or below 1 gig. That's so important when you architect. So thank you for that, and we'll come back to you, Gustav. So Ken, thinking like a CTO, Chief Technology Officer, title aside, and by the way, recognized as one of Bell Labs' distinguished members of its technical staff. That's a great shout out to you, and sorry for missing that one at the beginning. Ken, when somebody's taking on the time to modernize my utility, my network, you have to think about what we call in that OSI 7-layer stack of the physical connections and then obviously the applications. And somewhere in there is transport, private LTE, broadband, wireless connectivity. Talk to us a little bit about, what Christoph and Craig said, and how do you do that technology due diligence? How do you know what to go purchase or buy or learn more about?
I think that's a great question. I think it's a question that pretty much every customer starts with. You know, how do I break it down? Where do I go to look at it? I think if you take, you know, the security and standards pieces that Craig said, if you take the spectrum pieces that Christophe said, and the one other component that goes on top of that you see like in the CSP type networks today that could be leveraged by utilities is there's so many other parallel technologies on the packet side of the network, things like DWDM, moving towards IP-based networks, moving towards software-defined, and then overlaying automation on top, overlaying analytics that give you real-time feedback. So it's if you get the spectrum piece solved and you know what your approach to the spectrum is going to look like, then the ability to take some of the modern technologies and then leverage them to build out this network in a cost-effective way is something that has only been sort of gelling in the last probably 5 years or so. And then you see the CSPs adopting kind of best practices, pulling from the standards bodies some of the best practices that they've taken, and then applying them into their networks. I think that those are all key pieces for building a modern network. Aggregating multiple loads, it used to be in the past that if you wanted to do something like AMI or you wanted to do SCADA or a lot of the utility command and control functions, you built a purpose-built network, you isolated it for security. But these days with the technologies, the ability to do network slicing, the ability to do security on flows of traffic, I think that what you get is the ability to build these homogeneous networks that are multi-service that can not only integrate LTE, but wireline type technologies and be able to take all of the modern IoT pieces that Gustav brought up a moment ago, right? The sensors.
So let's build off that. I see Craig and I see Gustav nodding head, because now we're getting into, if we can accept, and maybe for our audience I can paint a picture. You know, the grid is an engineering marvel. I'm looking off statistics that I called 160,000 miles of high voltage power lines, 600,000 miles of transmission lines, 9,200 electric generating units. Folks, when you're driving on the highway, you see these things, these power lines, these wires that you never want to touch or drink water near. But that's our infrastructure. And when it's at risk physically or through a cyber attack, bad things happen, or services to us as human beings are not happening, if you will, or they're not provided. But let's make no mistake, a smart grid, a future state grid, you know, leveraging broadband, you know, and 900 megahertz, which is what Anterix is saying is very special when you're trying to do these mobile to mobile communications and using wireless connectivity or using private LTE as your backdrop or secondary network. A smart grid must be affordable, resilient, most important word today, resilient, and introducing new technologies is exciting, but take caution, because we have standards at NIST, Craig. So why don't you talk a little bit about some of that knowledge you have of the role that NIST is providing technology providers, cloud service providers can, so that when we build product, when we hire companies like Anterix to come in and others, and Motorola, Nokia, and Ericsson, that there's a good feeling of trust that they know how to build this next generation network. So can you talk a little bit about that technology insertion piece?
Yeah, I think, you know, going back to what we all agree on is standards is the key here, right? I mean, it's huge. We've been involved with the standards, and I think all aspects, right? Technology from LMR to LTE to SA6, mission critical push to talk. All of those things have standards that are only going to help the end user, right? And they're only going to help the panelists up here too to have interoperability. And I think the interoperability is the key thing that brings to the standards. NIST, NERC, everybody's, you know, we're all trying to do the right thing with standards and adopt to the standards. I think as the ecosystem grows, the Anterix spectrum, I think it's going to bring a lot to the table of the sub 1 gig. There'll be a lot more devices. I think standards will start to formulate around those devices as well. And you know, Gustav, you nailed it, right? I mean, everything's going to be a little bit different. Not every utility is the same, right? So if you look at an urban area and you have aggregation of a higher, concentration of end devices versus central Illinois, where you have small amount of IEDs on your feeders. So different topologies, Ken mentioned as well, right? I mean, it's a system that's going to be tailored to the customer, right? And understanding the needs and the technology is great, but what problems are we solving with the technology? I think we have to get down to with the standards around it. And the other thing too is the intelligence at the edge, right? I think we're really looking at how will that mitigate, if we can act, sense, communicate, analyze at the edge, how does that minimize the amount of bandwidth that we typically use today, right? We've always been kind of a one-way grid and a one-way polling engine, right? From our OSI, we've always gone out and pulled, 10,000 devices. Now, can we do things different with analytics at the edge? Absolutely. So I think when we start putting our future radar on, we look at, where we are today, where we need to be in 5 years from data build out, it's going to be significantly different with the amount of technology, devices, fault indicators, all of these devices potentially, pole monitoring, whatever it be, there's going to be a lot more devices on the network. So really have to try to prioritize those devices and make those devices smarter in the edge.
Gustav, comments? I mean, I saw you
Yeah,
nod.
yeah. I mean, Craig is dead on, right? As we think of the evolution of the grid, if you will, the grid ecosystem. 50 years ago or 100 years ago, when the grid was built, it was built as a sink. For those of us who've been in the industry, right? It always was a sink. Today, part of the grid can't even decide, am I a sink or a source? Going back to the point Craig was making, we've got DER devices that'll just kick on, say, a gaggle of solar panels at a community, at a microgrid, if you will. They'll fire off at 11:30 in the morning or 12 o'clock, depending on if the sun is shining, right? There are other DER devices or distributed energy resources, if you will, that will get injected into the grid. And suddenly, a part of the grid may act as a source rather than a sink. What does that do? It introduces noise. Harmonics, into the overall grid ecosystem. How do you deal with it? Ken, you brought it up. Craig, you talked about edge. Edge is becoming incredibly important. Intelligence at the edge. Even at Ericsson, what we're also looking at is, does the network spawn more use cases? Or do we need a network to serve some of the unserved use cases of today? It is a catch-22, right, guys? I mean, and we don't know which is the chicken and which is the egg, but we know we need both, right? We need this evolved, whether it's an LTE or whether it's eventually morphing into 5G, we need these standardized platforms, 3GPP standardized platforms, ecosystems, where such edge devices can interoperate with each other. Somebody is trying to sense environment. Somebody is trying to sense whether it's a DER problem. Somebody's trying to sense there is a lightning going on somewhere. What should I be doing? On the West Coast, this is a clear issue. Down conductor, that's fire, potential fire hazard. How do I sense and respond? That is going to be a key factor as we think about whether it's private LTE or I call private networks.
So I'm going to jump to Ken, and I'm going to keep building off this innovation and excitement around and smart grid, but we're never going to lose that tie back to the ping, power, and pipe, as I like to call it, and how to protect it. I want to make a quick reference to, hey, if you're reading anything these days or want to reference some of the acronyms we used, the Cybersecurity Framework version 1.1, you can find that on the NIST.gov website. NIST 800-160 version 2 is the Developing Cyber Resilient Systems, a great read, even if you just do the exec summary. of course, the Energy Act of 2020, the Broadband Data Act of 2020, and Securing 5G and Beyond Act of 2020. These are relevant documents and resources for you to see who's working collaboratively, and it's industry, government, and academia. And again, back to it's a plug, shameless plug or not, Anterix's active ecosystem program, bringing the communities together to solve greater good and protect humanity. That's what we're getting at today. Ken, I want to come to you because I know there's a lot of vendors, solution providers out there who say, I've got the tool, I've got the box, saying, and I can come in and if you retrofit this into your environment, I'm going to ask you to put on that CTO hat one more time, the architect hat, technology diligence. What challenges do you feel, say, the utility sector faces today? They may not want to talk about and say, hey, look how, we could be doing a better job, but what's an opportunity for utility to be proactive and say, should I start calling cyber vendors? Should I start calling, integrators? How can a utility get started to build that trusting relationship with a company to say, come on and help me, help my cyber hygiene, my physical cyber hygiene?
Yeah, I think that's a good point of view for a lot of utilities. We see that constantly with utilities, trying to figure out whether they want to kick the tires, do they want to invest in like an LTE network as an asset? And make no mistake about it. I mean, if you look at an LTE network, if you take what Christoph said, what Craig said about collapsing some of these networks together so that you can get better command and control across the network for all of your assets in one place. If you want that type of connectivity, then looking at an LTE network as an asset for the company, just like the electrical components are assets to the company, is a great way to start. And then going and looking at vendors that have experience building networks on the scale that you want to get to. I think every company that's in this panel is in that category for sure. Certainly, if you try and piece together several best of breed type of solutions, it's not necessarily a bad strategy. It just puts more work onto your individual teams to do more due diligence to make sure that all the interoperability is already there. When you look at vendors that have already built large networks that work with the carriers, all of the standards that Craig talked about earlier, the 3GPP, the IETF, that they've all been tested for interoperability between all the vendors, even the ones on this phone or on this panel. I think that those are all things that should be taken under consideration. I think that the things you referenced, like the NIST framework for security, I think that is a great place to start for some lessons learned, or to figure out, what due diligence do I need to tell my team to look for if I'm going to build a large LTE network as an asset. I think that when you look at the things Craig brought up earlier, like the effect of COVID, for example, DDoS attacks went up by 50%, over the last year, just from what we've been able to measure in the networks that we support. The amount of people that are working from home that are trying to manage assets remotely instead of being able to go in and manage those assets directly, those kind of create attack vectors that are interesting if you're a bad actor, and you have to make sure that those are secured so that you can do the remote management of the grid. So those, again, not to come back to the standards too often, but again, relying on the standards, relying on vendors that have a lot of lessons learned from having deployed these, are going to be all your friend when you're looking at this.
Yeah, it's the architect, invest, implement mantra. We in government, or at least when I was in government, we'd preach around enterprise architecture. What are you trying to do? And I'm going to come to Craig here because he made a great comment, tweetable comment, is what problem are you trying to solve, right? It's not, oh, I better go buy this device and plug a synchrophaser in, or can I get that at Best Buy, plug it in and I'm good? No, we know that, but we sometimes don't think about the implications of a technology, even if it has standards baked into it. So thank you, Ken. And Craig, let me come back because, again, you sell to utilities, or they call you and say, come in and tell me what you got. Here's what I'm trying to do. Can you speak to this concept of private LTE? Is it a hot space now? Are you seeing people ask about it? We talk about future-proofing our networks, having redundancy and resiliency and reliability built in. How prevalent is private LTE in that dialogue?
Yeah, so I would say, Pete, and I think everybody would agree with me, every utility that we're engaging with is in the exploration or discovery stage. Some are much farther along than others. When we sit down with them to really educate them, it's like, hey, what's the problem you guys have, right? How do we make operation? How do we create operational efficiencies? How do we create employee safety, right? Those are the two big things, right? And then what problems are you solving? We really sit down and listen to them before we say, here's what you need, and understand what is their coverage impact? What is their capacity impact? What is their capabilities that they're willing to take on, right? Do they want to be able to manage this thing? They want to own, operate, they want to manage service, they want a hosted core, do they want a on-prem core, and then the other capabilities, right? I mean, so, and then the big other portion of that is cost, right? I mean, you start spewing all this stuff out to them, they say, yeah, build this, build this, build this, and next thing you know, you've got a tower everywhere, and oh well, we can't, we can't get over that initial capex cost, and there's no way we're going to have the downstream opex spend that would cost. So we really got to create a starting point, right? What is that starting point? How do we alleviate their biggest pain points and not forklift what we're doing today, right? So have a no regret starting point of here's what you can do, here's where we're at, here's the spectrum. I think, the Anterix spectrum's out there. I think Gustav, you mentioned, hey, it propagates, it's got bandwidth. And if you look at the use cases, I think in UBA, there's a use case group inside of the UBA organization. If you're not familiar with it, I would go to the UBA homepage, look at the use cases that group created. It'll give you an understanding of everything that they're doing, from DA to drones to you name it, right? I think the big one we haven't even touched upon today is EV charging. I think that's really going to impact the industry, and we talked to them about that. So I think all of those things really, when we sit down initially, that's the starting point, is to understand pain points.
I know it can be distilled down to my whiskey reference. There's always going to be one. Big fan of the whiskey. Collecting and learning. But that distilling down, sometimes it's, what are you trying to solve? What do you want to know more about, versus coming in hard with a pitch? And
Yeah.
I'm going to say thank you, Craig, and going to Kustov here. The American Jobs Plan of 2021, high level, $2 trillion proposal, transportation, power generation, electrical vehicle investments. By the way, that's where I wanted to give you that shout out there, Craig. Resiliency, clean water, broadband, manufacturing, supply chain. I mean, this is the stuff we all use every day. And if I'm an owner and operator and I'm considering, if it ain't broke, I don't have to fix it, I think that's not the most ideal way to live, right? Because something bad most likely will happen. Gustav, how do you, or maybe taking off just even your hat, what would you encourage a utility to think about in this digital transformation in the utility sector, so that they could say, I should be doing that, I should be investing in? What are what's your sage advice?
It's a great point, and I'll take off from one point that Craig alluded to. I look at this confluence between the power industry, the telecom industry, and the transportation, or the electrification of the transportation industry. Craig, you alluded to the EV charging infrastructure, right? It is absolutely the oncoming freight train that the industry is going to face, right? Because it's a completely new kind of load for a utility. Let's hold that thought for a second. But if you think of the three pointy ends of a triangle with those three, and you think of a community in the middle of it, a city, a municipality, call it a smart city of some sort, right? This is an incredible opportunity that we have in front of us to bring these industries not only together, but interoperate together within that ecosystem. Okay? You need power no matter what. I think it is pretty well established. The fact that the 3 or 4 of us are sitting here on this panel, the communications is as important as power today, right? And we really are mobile creatures at the end of the day. Last 14 months, it hasn't felt like it, but we are. We're inherently, social animals, right? And so if you put the community or society in the middle and you try to tie those three, whether you call it private LTE or whether you call it 5G or what have you, and you put that blanket, that wireless two-way communications blanket across it, it becomes a very, very powerful mechanism that fuels not only the infrastructure growth, if you will, but it also advances some of the goals we as a society have taken on. Take CO2 out of, as much of CO2 out of our ecosystem as possible, right? I mean, let's get to uh, net zero as quickly as we can. But you need this trifecta to come together and play together for this to happen. And we're seeing that. I mean, we're seeing in several communities in Europe, particularly in the Nordic states, we are seeing it in Germany as well. And we're seeing in pockets happening in the US. But we need a bigger push and we need a faster push in this regard. And I agree with Craig. I think if people could log into UBBA and look at some of those use cases, I like to always say it's a use case, stupid. I mean, that's what it is all about at the end of the day. Use cases drive your investments and outcomes.
Kustov, I love that. And those who know me, facts tell, stories sell.
Yep.
A picture's worth 1,000 words. Breaking it down to look what this country's doing with. And when we get hung up on the inertia around policy and mandate, and hey, the pandemic showed what we can do with a vaccine when life is at stake. And I think what we got on every computer out there is our brain, the most powerful in the world, and human intuition, collaborative communities, learning from others. If we can just drop the ego at the door, and I know that's what we're doing today, but also to convey that it's safety first. And every utility, I think, would say that. So thank you on that point. I love this, the spectrum as an enabler is what I took away from your comments. It's an enabler and it fuels, but also can mitigate risk. So Ken, your thoughts on this topic of tech insertion and how and what could the utility industry maybe be doing more of or being more proactive about, whether it's leveraging AI, machine learning, but to kind of say, what can I do to create a resilient infrastructure?
I think it's all of those. I think that when you're looking at the technology, you look at the amount of sensors that could be in the grid to allow for adoption of renewables or islanding, micro generation. They talk about virtual power plants in the future where you have, companies that are managing groups of virtual power plants that are out there in the generation. So, think of a load that needs to be managed that's outside of your direct control, as it were. That those are all things that where looking to some of the technologies that are available now for collaboration, for getting the real-time information back, taking some of you mentioned machine learning and analytics, for example, allowing for machine learning to pull out some of the trends that maybe wouldn't have been noticed or would have taken a long time, weeks or months, in order to be able to notice those types of trends, so you have the more efficient management. I also think that, when you look at the younger generation of people that are coming out of the universities today, when you look at, where do they want to work? You mentioned job creation. Where do they want to work? What do they want to touch? They're very diligent with social with social awareness, and they want to work at places that are adopting new technologies, but being socially aware about doing it at the same time. So I think that if utilities are also looking to bring in new, fresh people with new, fresh views, that looking to give them technologies that they want to use, that they're used to using, are going to be challenges that they're going to want to look at, not just for how to manage the grid, but how do I prepare the utility for its future workforce.
What an awesome segue, because I was thinking of a question for Craig, which I think can feed into this. And this is going to be for everybody, but I have to riff off that. The United States government, especially in the technology community, but also in the critical infrastructure community, talks about transformation with IT, the power of data and the accountability of it, the ability to share data in a secure manner, and then the 21st century workforce. So my question is going to be partly, if you could build it in, Craig, Christoph, and Ken, you hit it, but maybe to finish that one out before we go to parting shots, is this workforce, the kids that are learning about pandemics at this age and working remote and being mobile. And I mean, you're right, Christoph. I mean, this isn't a new normal. This is the normal. When I think of what it's going to take to retain, recruit, and reskill employees, whether they're a 50-year veteran at a utility that understands industrial control systems and the operational technology environment, is worried about, I'm going to lose my job if I have to integrate IT, I say, heck no. That's institutional knowledge that has to be baked into this next generation architecture. And maybe we have that 50 or 60-year-old person working with a 20-year-old millennial saying, let me show you how it was built, kiddo, and let's see how these sensors can work. So I'm excited about the opportunity for a workforce. Paula Gold-Williams, who I adore, is the CEO of CPS Energy and always talks about the next generation. So thank you for really bringing that to light for me, and it got me pretty excited. Craig, and for each of you, you work at incredible, globally recognized companies. I know there is a technology roadmap. I know that you're thinking about new stuff that's proprietary, but can help you sell product and service, but in the greater good concept. What is something that you can speak to that's publicly available about what you enjoy, what you're excited to go talk to a utility about, whether it is private LTE, whether it is wireless communications, whether it's how you protect the data on a device. What is the thing on the slide in the deck that you can't wait to get to, Craig, when you're frankly pitching your capability?
Yeah, there's so many of them, right? Because it's such an exciting time, right? So I think it goes back to some of the capabilities that we didn't have before around spectrum, right? Excites me around the Anterix spectrum with the rules and report and order of having the high power capability. I think that will, to Christoph's point earlier, is to create pockets of different topologies of technology, right? I mean, not so much technology, but different ways we use the technology, right? Where we can cover more area and create a lower TCO, if you will, right? A starting point to get the utilities excited. But I think the other thing that excites me a lot is really the investments that we're working on with intelligence at the edge, not just from IoT devices, but with video. We made some substantial acquisitions in the last 3 years around video with a lot of analytics, right? So transforming that video analytics, hundreds of patents in those cameras, how do we take that from a security world that we're in today and put that into a utility world to start making intelligent decisions at the edge, analyzing things at the edge, acting on those, communicating those. And it's not just communicating it back to SCADA, it's in parallel communicating it to device to people, everybody that needs to know what's going on with that, right? And I think that's where we didn't have that before, and that's where we're going. So that's really what excites me, is the flexibility and the augmentation of existing systems as well, right? I mean, this is not going to be a switch that we flip overnight, right? There's a lot of work to do before we can just say, boom, private LTE is up and running, right? We've got AMI networks, we've got our land mobile radio networks. How do we converge those networks? And I think product development around all three of them are things that are going to help the industry as well.
Amen to all of that. Gustav, your perspective from your organization.
Yeah, I mean, look, all three, we work for some haloed names in this industry, right? 100-year-old companies. I think of what really excites me and the colleagues I work with, what Ericsson stands for, and some of the investments we continue to make in this industry. I think of it as what I call as connective tissues. Okay. Yes, I may be somebody focused on the utilities vertical per se, trying to create opportunities that within the industry or to foster the growth in this industry, if you will, and solve utilities industry's problems. But utilities as an industry is not a silo. It is something that touches each one of us. How are we solving societal connected problems or connected opportunities? How do we translate something that we build for the utilities industry and then transform it into a smart ecosystem for a community, right? How do we create a more sustainable environment for us and people and generations who will come after us, right? And so it doesn't, the innovations that we are making, whether it's within our product portfolios or in our strategy as well, but the core of our strategy is the sustainability of what we develop for one industry. How does it impact other industries in a positive way? That's what I call as the connective tissue. We are in the telecom industry, telecom world. But how are we using a telecom concept to further the cause of the utilities industry? How are we using a smarter way to live in an environment, creating sustainable sources of energy, and transform that, let's say, into the telecom world, right? Taking diesel generators out of cell sites, creating maybe storage solutions. And that's a power industry concept we're now transporting into the telecom industry. If we could do that, can we then take it to a transportation industry? How do we transform that and transport that into that transportation industry, right? So these are the things that kind of people like me think about all day long, and how do we execute on this? That's kind of excites me.
No, it does. And I'm gonna just say I wrote down, Craig Video Analytics, and it's this AI, machine learning, cool capabilities. We can use tools now to give us those insights, those actionable and applied insights. The societal economic value, good stuff. And by the way, Ken, I was the CTO at 2 cabinet level agencies, and I always said I was a connective tissue officer. So I'm gonna just let you know, it was like I was a door knocker. So I think that's what was needed. But Gustav, seriously, like you just hit the tapestry that is being woven among sectors horizontally versus this important and surgical
Exactly.
silos or cylinders of excellence that is needed. We need to have that connective tissue. So well stated and articulated. And for the record too, you may have mentioned 100-year-old companies among your great organizations. The grid's over 100 years too, so not a bad group of 3 here, folks, to understand this thing that powers our country. Ken, your thoughts on workforce, and you kicked this off and got me going on how we have to be thinking about this to embrace the innovation component of a smarter grid.
Yeah, I think probably maybe a closing thought might be that something you brought up earlier is about technology causing job loss. I don't think that's the case. I think that if there's anything the pandemic's taught us, it's that the human interactions that we use over things like video, this panel, working with coworkers, hopefully that kind of collaboration that we're having to do and work so hard at in a virtual environment, that will carry back to when we can return to the workplace and you have that tighter human interaction. And to tie that back to the previous point that I asked you about, it's because I don't think that the technology is taking humans out of the equation. I think what it is it's enabling sort of an augmented human interaction with the grid, with whatever with whatever new innovations that we want to try and achieve. I think that if you can reduce the amount of time it takes to come to a resolution by using a machine that's interacting with a human, I think that if you transfer some skill sets from maybe the newer workforce to the older workforce, the opposite direction of what you just said. So it goes both ways. The existing experienced workforce teaches the new workforce about how it got built, but then at the same time, the new workforce teaches the existing workforce, how do I get where I need to be?
Hey, that doesn't count as your parting shot, but that counts as your pre-parting shot because that was amazing. Okay, well, look, it's 11:55. We've got 5 solid minutes, and I would like to use this time because number one, thank you for your incredible insights. But Craig, Gustav, Ken, you're thought leaders, you're change agents. You represent your brand and your company, but you're representing yourself. And folks, I hope, are learning today and striving to want to know more. You've done that in spades. So, Craig, what is I call it tweetable moments, light bulb moments. What's something you either gleaned from today or just want to leave with the audience so they walk away wanting for more? What is your parting shot? And then I'm going to go to Gustav and Kenneth.
Wow, that's a tough one, Pete. There's so many different things out there, but I guess the changing of the grid, right? The ERs we mentioned, but really just figuring out where we are today. I would say to the utilities, like I said earlier, let's look at a starting point to figure out with the standards where there's no regret of what we do today is going to be non-forklift, right? We're gonna continue to grow off of what we start today because there's so many changes out there and technology is changing so fast. I would say to the utilities, get your stakeholders involved, right? Get your policymakers, your regulators, your innovators that are on this call, right? Get us involved. Get your consumers involved because it's going to be huge of how the consumption of energy is going to, I mean, when you start getting into residential solar, you start getting into EV charging, the consumption patterns are going to be so different that the utilities have to get engaged with that. So I think those are the big things. And then we talked about, a lot of different things here, but I mean, we could talk for, hours and hours. So I'll give the other guys some time here.
Well done. I loved it. I wrote down 3 things that you said. So 3 tweets, at least in my book. Gustav.
It is a toughie. We all can talk for hours. I would say understand your problem statement. Understand the use cases first. Connect that with the stakeholders Craig alluded to. Understand the drivers. Is the driver to reduce your operational expenses, your unforeseen operational expenses, for example, right? Understand the core 3 factors that utilities live by: safety, resiliency, reliability. How, whatever investment you're about to make, how does this correlate to those 3 core factors? That's the day job for utilities, literally keeping the lights on safely, as they say, right? And so I would say understanding your drivers, stakeholders, and the end goal, technology will solve itself. I mean, 3 incredible companies sitting on this panel, and there are many others. We will solve technology. That's the easy part. The hard part is understanding the why, the what, the how. That is the most important.
Love it. Well done. Drop the mic. Ken, finish this off here.
Yeah, I echo the thoughts that Craig and Gustav had. I think that I think they're all relevant. I think if I was to summarize that, I would just say that my parting comment would be to embrace the digital transformation, the change to the digital era, if it will. I think that for people that are maybe resisting it, they have a good solid foundation of why. We just need to build their confidence, and the technologies are an enabler for them to be able to do a much better job at what they're at what their goals are. And I think that once you see that digitizing the physical world that the grid is used to being, that all of the gains from those digitalizations of the grid are going to be worth it going forward for all of the innovations like renewables that are coming that we need to deal with. So embrace the embrace the digital era.
Well said. My parting shot. Big time thank you. Each of you brought some interesting perspective, even for me. I thank, meaning that I could always learn, and I'm curious, and I love learning. You did that in so many ways. Thank you, Anterix, for the opportunity. Get involved with the Active Ecosystem program. The launch was yesterday. You won't believe the incredible companies already on board. I think they have 37 members, and you can learn more. Having an opportunity to meet with Morgan O'Brien every week, the sage mentor that he's been, is a joy. And I love learning, and his passion and leading a company, and Rob and Chris and others. It's truly an honor to be affiliated with you. So today, folks, if you tuned in, you can watch this. You can watch it again. Christoph, Ken, and Craig, each of you just brings that passion and insight. Keep doing it. Educate, inform, and enlighten. And hey, until the next time, have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, Pete.
Thanks, Pete. And thanks to Anterix again.
You're hosting us.